If you were to line up 10 random people and ask them these 3 questions, could you tell who the Christians are? Question 1, how do you spend your time? Question 2, how do you spend your money? And finally, question 3, who do you serve? You could probably ask that one first. But would you be able to tell the Christians apart from the non-Christians? I'll answer that question for you. It would be extremely difficult in our culture because Christians are hardly distinguishable from non-Christians. There isn't much difference in the lives of a person who goes to church on Sunday and the person who's never been to church any day. We spend our time doing mostly the same things, especially in our free time. We spend our money on mostly the same things. And I'm not talking about essentials, but non-essentials. And so-called Christians are hardly faithful in tithing or in offering. And most Christians, again, so-called, could hardly say they're serving others and most of all the Lord above themselves, just like a non-believer. Consequently, people of the Christian church are not exactly modeling the behavior of Christ, but that of the world. We talk like the world, we act like the world, we look like the world, we live like the world. In fact, most people who verbally express some sort of allegiance to the Christian faith are conforming themselves to the image of this world, which we'll come back to later. And though there are countless examples of this, let's consider one example in recent news. Lecrae Moore is a 43-year-old rapper who, for years, has wanted nothing to do with the moniker Christian rapper. His website bio describes one of Lecrae's earlier mixtapes, it's called Church Clothes, as, quote, "the first time someone planted their feet simultaneously in the streets and in the church without compromising." Now just remember that quote. Now, I would say that is mostly correct, but that was 11 years ago. My wife and I loved that mixtape, Church Clothes. We went to see Lecrae live in Atlanta and randomly met him and several of his co-rappers at a New Era hat store there. He was nice and receptive, and we had a good time that night at that concert. The first song from that mixtape, Church Clothes, by Lecrae, begins with these lyrics. And again, this is the introduction track. The opening lyrics say, "R.I.P. to Medgar Evers, R.I.P. to Dr. King. I ain't trying to hate on my own kind, but Al and Jesse don't speak for me." So he gives some recognition to 2 civil rights activists of old, and then distances himself from 2 modern civil rights activists, Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, which is shocking to hear from a rapper. However, knowing he would receive hate for this song and the album and his association with Jesus Christ, he says, "I'm probably going to catch some flack, man, but I'm going to swallow this pill like Pac-Man, like swallow this hard truth. Some of these folks won't tell the truth, too busy trying to get them racks, man." Later, he says, "Bookstore pimping them hope books like God don't know how broke looks, and telling me that I'm going to reap a mill if I sow into these low crooks." Now there he's taken a jab at prosperity preachers and televangelists. Then, ironically, in rapping about the hypocrisy of the church, Lecrae raps, "As long as the church keep wilding out, I can justify all my foolish deeds. Smoking weed, pouring up, keep that lean up in my cup. Maybe I could change the world, but this porn on my laptop got me stuck." Now, we don't have time to analyze Lecrae's entire discography, but this is the Lecrae we were experiencing in 2012. Church Clothes was the album or mixtape that really put Lecrae out into the mainstream. But he had been putting out albums since 2004, like Real Talk, After the Music Stops, which was the first album that I heard of his, and then Rebel, and then Rehab. Shortly after the release of Church Clothes, he put out a great album called Gravity in 2012 again, and then Anomaly in 2014. And then everything started to go downhill. Lecrae started to evoke racial tensions in his lyrics, turning his musical gifts into activist weapons more and more as time went on. And fast forward to 2022, and Lecrae releases Church Clothes Volume 4. Its intro track is a lot different than the 2012 introduction. Lecrae begins the track by rapping, R.I.P. Breonna Taylor, R.I.P. to George Floyd. I ain't trying to hate on my own kind, but Warnock ain't my only choice. And Herschel either, I love believers. Again, we're not going to get deep into all the lyrics, but in the opening lines you can see the vast ideological contrast in just a decade of time. Breonna Taylor was killed in the crossfire when her boyfriend fired at the police. George Floyd died of a fentanyl overdose, but Lecrae jumped onto the racially woke train, making him no different than Black Lives Matter. He says, Warnock ain't my only choice, talking about Raphael Warnock, the extremely liberal pastor in Georgia who was very supportive of killing babies, who's also very supportive of President Biden, and who defeated Herschel Walker in the Georgia Senate race last year. Now, there's actually plenty of other examples in Lecrae's recent music, like the song Still in America, but I'll just mention a few more things. Do you remember earlier this year when Chick-fil-A caught some flack for hiring an officer of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Well, that inspired a lot of sort of investigative journalism, which churned out all sorts of garbage on our favorite chicken restaurant, like money to woke causes and the CEO's liberalism. For example, this clip went somewhat viral around that time. This is a clip from Passion City Church in June of 2020, when, as you remember, racial tensions were the highest they've been in a long time. And it was during the worst of COVID, so it was live streamed online. But the first person you'll see is the CEO of Chick-fil-A, Dan Cathy, sharing a short story about white guilt, which is followed by something interesting. Watch.
Some of our closing moments here, but a story that was shared with me by a dear friend who shared with me about a revival that was taking place at a church in Texas. And at that revival, on the front seat was an older African-American man that was sitting there. And this young man got up that was there in that service, and he'd been so gripped with conviction about the racism that was in that local community in a small town in Texas that he took a shoe brush and he walked over to this elderly gentleman and he knelt on his knees and began to shine his shoes. And tears began to flow in that service. It was an attitude of conviction. So I invite folks to put some words to action here. And if we need to find somebody that needs to have their shoe shine, we need to just go right on over and shine their shoes. And whether they got tennis shoes on or not, maybe they got sandals on, it really doesn't matter. But there's a time in which we need to have, some personal action here. Maybe we need to give them a hug too, brother.
And some stock in Chick-fil-A.
But I bought about 1,500 of these, and I gave to all our Chick-fil-A operators and staff a number of years ago. And so any expressions of a contrite heart, of a sense of humility, a sense of shame, a sense of embarrassment, beget with an apologetic heart. I think that.
In case you didn't know what Lecrae looks like, that's him getting his shoes cleaned by a white man who feels guilty about his white privilege. Now, to be fair, there were a lot of Christians and Christian churches that month that came out in full support of the BLM movement because, like the majority, They were reacting based on emotion and fear, not reason and logic, and they unwittingly sponsored an outright Marxist organization. That's the very small excuse I'm going to give to Passion City and maybe even Dan Cathy, but not Lecrae. White people like Louis Giglio and Dan Cathy and Stephen Furtick and others all wanted to virtue signal and wear their white guilt like a patch of pride in June 2020. But people like Lecrae benefit from stoking racial animosity, just like politicians and just like the two activists he disowned a decade earlier. Now let's fast forward to today. Lecrae has a new product line that sells under the banner Righteous and Ratchet. And there's even a shirt for the ladies with this slogan printed on the front. And for those of you who may be uncultured, ratchet is not referring to a standard tool in the garage. Ratchet is a slang term which Urban Dictionary would define like attitude and sassy, smart-mouthed, temperamental, nasty and mean, childish, rude and crude, obnoxious, unruly and out of control, disrespectful, aggressive, or wanting to fight over nothing. And there's another set of shirts on the site, one for the ladies which says, I can quote Cardi B and Corinthians. And also one for the guys which reads, I can quote Kendrick and Corinthians. Cardi B and Kendrick Lamar are two other hip-hop artists whose lyrics are so profane, I can't even quote them on the show. They are sexually explicit and vulgar, riddled with endless profanity and violence and drug references and alcoholism and to use a slang term, ratchetness. On his last album, Kendrick Lamar frequently depicts himself in a crown of thorns. And you probably remember the name Cardi B because she made probably the most notorious song of all time with another classy lady, Megan Thee Stallion, and I can't even tell you the name of that song because it's so explicit. Obviously, Lecrae is exhibiting a belief system that colludes worldliness and godliness into this impossible mixture. That's why he's perpetrating reverse racism. That's why he's co-signing cultural monsters like Cardi B and George Floyd. That's why he's selling merchandise and music to do the same. The only problem is oil and water do not mix. 1 Peter 1:14 says, As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in ignorance, but, like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior, because it is written, You shall be holy, for I am holy. In the beginning of this passage, Peter makes it clear that Christians, or genuine children of God, are those that are obedient to Him. Then he gives some clarity as to what obedience looks like in the form of contrasting terms for what Paul would eventually call later on the sons of disobedience, or those that are not truly Christian. He says, Do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance. And that means that obedience to God means you no longer seek to fulfill the lusts of your flesh, which just comes from spiritual ignorance. This also implies that those who don't belong to the Lord do seek to fulfill the lusts of their flesh because of their ignorance. Now, so far in this single verse, 1 Peter 1:14, we're shown a few contrasting examples. A person that is obedient or one that is disobedient. A person who is a son of God or a person who is a son of disobedience. A person who denies their lusts or their desires in obedience to God, or a person who satisfies their lusts. And finally, one who is wise and one who is ignorant. Now, for the remainder of this passage in verse 15 and 16, we're shown the most important contrast and distinction of all: holy and unholy. And once again, Peter says, and he's just flowing from his description of obedient children, he says, "But like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior, because it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy." Now, Peter begins verse 15 by explaining the reason for our obedience. Did you catch what it is? We are to be obedient and spiritual and wise children of God because He is holy. Now, the Greek word for holy here is the word hagios, and it truly describes everything that is the complete opposite of worldliness and unrighteousness and sin and evil. The word means different, and its biblical usage is meant to convey set apartness and sacredness. And just as with the proper explanation of defining things like love and joy and peace, hagios, or holy, is perfectly defined by the nature of God because it is who He is. It comes from Him. So holiness is to say godliness. Now, this is further clarified by the context of the passage from 1 Peter. Verse 15 is a demand or a call to holiness, which is accordingly displayed through our behavior, or some translations use the word conduct. That's why the 14th verse speaks of our former lustful ignorance. Prior to giving our lives over to the Lordship of Christ, our lives can pretty much be defined as unholy. We were not like Jesus at all. We were sons of disobedience who walked in the flesh, and all of our words and actions proved it. But becoming a genuine Christian means that all of our conduct changes to resemble that of Christ. Peter quotes the book of Leviticus in verse 16 when he says, "It is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy." These are words inscribed directly from the Lord Himself several times in the book of Leviticus, which is a law book. For example, in Leviticus 11:45, God says, "For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus, you shall be holy, for I am holy." That's in the middle of laws talking about food, but God would say something similar to this several other times amid other sections of laws, like, "Do these things because I am holy." The Hebrew word for holy there, compared to the Greek hagios, means the exact same thing. In other words, God is saying, you shall be separate. You shall be apart because I am apart. I am separate. You shall be holy and set apart because I am holy and set apart. Well, separate from what? Apart from what? The Apostle Paul would answer that question like this: do not be conformed to this world. That's Romans 12:2. In 1 John 2, we're told, do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. You could say he's not holy. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. Those are the unholy things. The world is passing away, and also its lusts. But the one who does the will of God lives forever. So the world and worldliness is the antithesis of holiness. It is the opposite of God. Lecrae is being driven by the winds of doctrine, as Paul would eventually talk about in Ephesians 4. And he's so overly determined by his striving for relevancy that he has a foot in both camps, because there's only two of them. And it reminds me of something that God will say to the church in Laodicea, which John inscribed in Revelation chapter 3. God will say to that church, which speaks to us today, and hopefully speaks to Lecrae, I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish that you were cold or hot. So because you are lukewarm and neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. So I also wish that Lecrae would either be hot or cold, that he would get off of the proverbial fence, because he is an extreme example of hypocrisy, liberal Christianity, and secularism, even though those are such diametrically opposed terms. In fact, Lecrae is really a microcosm of what the American church suffers from: worldliness. It's why the church is declining in attendance. We're at a 60-year low in America. And why? Why would non-believers want anything to do with something that makes no difference in their lives? The Christians that we present to the culture are just mirror images in practically every way to those who reject Christ outright. Now, some of you may want me to add Oliver Anthony to this conversation, because he professes to be a Christian and reads the Bible at his concerts and then uses profanity in his music, among other things. But the difference here is that Oliver is a fairly new Christian. He's just starting to figure some of these things out, and I have no idea what sort of spiritual guidance he has in his life. I could also talk about other professed Christian celebrities like Justin Bieber and Carrie Underwood and plenty of other actors and actresses and professional athletes who exhibit these same exact inconsistencies and split devotions. But Lecrae has professed his Christianity for a long time. Now, there's another Christian rapper who goes by the stage name D1. He publicly confronted Lecrae about these product choices. Here's what he had to say.
What up, y'all? I wanted to explain my heart behind why I chose to publicly address Lecrae. So we serve the same God, and God's word and God's message does not change. So when I saw that he used his large platform to publicly push and promote and glorify a lifestyle of being righteous and ratchet, I was like, nah. I have a responsibility to use my large public platform to put a message out and let people know that we as believers do not all agree with that, and we don't stamp that, we don't co-sign that, right? Because the world needs to hear that alternative perspective. The tough part is when we communicate it behind the scenes, and I'm thinking we come to an agreement and an understanding of like the fact that that could be problematic or misleading for people, that 2 days later he still chose to want to monetize the moment and move forward with dropping shirts that say righteous and ratchet, and then a shirt saying, I can quote Cardi B and Corinthians. So then it's seeming like you're putting the business before the ministry, and we got to be careful about that in life. When you're doing ministry and business, it should never be business and then ministry. And the Great Commission like calls us as believers to make disciples of all the nations. And it's seeming like sometimes people trying to make customers of all the nations before disciples, you know what I'm saying? So if things get put out there publicly, I'm going to address them publicly. I'm not going to let that slide, but it's no hate.
Coincidentally, Lecrae removed only the Cardi B shirts from that product line, but we'll see if he denounces the rest of his wokeness, his racism, and his worldliness in due time. Until then, let's support people like D1 and even rebuke people like this gentleman, because if there's one thing that God detests, it's being lukewarm, because he wants you to be holy as he is holy. The majority of you are coffee drinkers, and maybe some of you fancy yourselves coffee connoisseurs. Well, whether you're someone who likes to down a quick cup to get a caffeine dose, or you enjoy the art of crafting an excellent cup of joe, you've got to give my friends at Blackout Coffee a shot. They've got bags of ground or whole bean coffee or single serve pods. They've got many different blends and flavors and roasts. My personal favorite is Morning Reaper. It's one of their medium roasts. So use my code Blake23 for 20% off. That's BLAKE23 for a discount, and level up your morning cup with Blackout Coffee.